Hi, and welcome to, I think it's our module 7. We've done several of these so far over the past year around verbal de-escalation. So if this is your first time starting with module 7, that's absolutely fine. You don't have to do them in any sort of order, but just a reminder that there are 6 other modules and there's 1 module left to come. So if you're the type of person who likes to kind of build on some skills versus focusing in on one particular kind of skill like we are today around managing aggressive behavior, feel free to access any of those other modules because the skills do build on one another, but these videos can also be watched in isolation. So welcome or welcome back. We're excited to be with you today for hopefully, depending on how much Steph and I talk, should be around an hour, but we'll see. For those of you who don't know us, we're going to introduce ourselves really quickly. My name is Stacy Hopkins-Trump, and I am a behavioral consultant in special education at the ISD. So when we talk about managing aggressive behavior, one of our main roles as behavior consultants is we support teams who are supporting students who have pretty intensive behaviors that sometimes reach the level of aggression and violence. So we're glad to share some of our experiences with you here today.
Yes, and I'm Stephanie Dye, and I'm also a special ed behavior consultant at the ISD. And yeah, we're excited. This is kind of our wheelhouse here. And so if you've gotten this far or have a student in specific that you're thinking of, this is the way to give you some tools just to help you look at what you need to do in helping de-escalate those aggressive behaviors.
So today for our agenda, if you have watched any of the other modules, we'll start out with a little bit of a review. So if you haven't watched some of the other ones, it'll kind of catch you up a little bit. And if you have, it'll just be a little review for you. We're going to also talk about the different types of aggression today, which is very important when thinking about how we respond to student behavior. So learning and thinking about the different types of behavior will be very helpful in your classrooms and in your schools. And then really digging into 4 elements of a potentially violent situation. So we really are talking about those students who are in crisis today and trying to prevent their behaviors from reaching that level of violence. And then finally, we're going to talk about a specific skill set, a specific technique called crisis co-regulation that Steph's going to talk about a little later, that really shows how to support when a student is in that crisis mode. You can picture the students screaming, yelling, even potentially throwing things. So kind of we're there. And then really thinking about when do I call support versus, is this something that I can handle on my own? And then we'll do a nice little closing and remind you of the final module that we'll be doing. So we always want to bring in the goal of verbal de-escalation. There's really 2, but through the first 7 modules, we've really focused on supporting students. And there's 2 different ways we do that. I mean, you can think of some of your students who, when they're not regulated and they're not in control, that's a very emotional reaction. So we need to be there to support them emotionally, but we also need to remember to support them environmentally. And with that, we mean, sometimes we'll hear people say, I don't understand, like she was just sitting there and then stuff went flying. There are things that happen in the environment that if we're not paying attention to those can really have an impact on a student. Like even when someone new or different walks in the room, maybe the noise level in the room, maybe the expectations have changed. Just anything like that in the environment, we also need to be really aware of when we're supporting students. That really impacts their stress levels. So being able to recognize those changes emotionally and environmentally to help reduce that stress and the risk of potential crisis or violence. In our next module, finally, the last one, so on the 8th, the very final one, we talk about the teaching component of verbal de-escalation. And we purposely leave that out right now because when a student is in crisis, when we are in crisis, that is not the time for new learning. So we just really want to be very aware of that. So we first started out this whole series talking about self-awareness. And there's 4 questions that we can ask ourselves in any situation, in addition to responding to any sort of crisis situation. I think these are good to just even ask yourself throughout the day. So the first thing is, what am I feeling right now? especially in response to a crisis. Have you been dealing with this student for the last hour and you're like, oh, right now I'm feeling drained, I'm feeling irritated, or oh, the last time I responded in this situation, it didn't go so well, so I'm feeling a little anxious, or I'm feeling a little nervous, or I'm feeling like I don't really know what's going on. I don't know what I'm walking into. So just being aware of that feeling, even if you're not able to change it in that moment, just knowing how your feelings might impact how you respond to a student. And then we have to think about, what does this student feel, need, or want? I think sometimes we jump to trying to respond without really thinking that through in that moment. Or sometimes it's like, I'm irritated right now. This kid is just doing this to tick me off. And then, of course, our response usually doesn't help the situation. So really thinking through in that moment, what might that student feel, need, or want? It might not be what you think they need to be doing in that moment. But remember, our whole goal is to prevent crisis from happening, to support that student emotionally and environmentally. And then how is the environment impacting that student? We already talked about that a little bit, but just in looking around and taking everything in. And this is a quick assessment, right? As soon as you are responding to this situation, you're asking yourself all of these things and kind of assessing throughout. And then finally, like, how do I best respond? We just want to make sure that our responses, to the best of our ability, aren't triggering that student further, and making sure that in our minds, we are supporting them the best way we can. Now, sometimes we do all of those things, and does the situation still continue to escalate? Yes, possibly, but just really making sure you are really aware of your own feelings when you're responding to those students, and making sure that you're supporting the best way you know how, without your emotional reaction leading to further escalation with that student. So that's just kind of a reminder of our own self-awareness. And that's kind of where we start with the foundation of the verbal de-escalation. So here we are with this triangle. You'll see this repeated throughout this series. This really comes from, and we have to give credit to, you'll see TCI at the top of the slide here. It stands for Therapeutic Crisis Intervention. And that really is a system to support students and teach them new skills to avoid the behavior escalation, or when we do get into that crisis situation or escalation, we have the skills and systems within our buildings to support them. And then once all is said and done after the crisis situation, we have the ability to look at what happened, be able to look at what we need to do in the future as teams and as buildings to support these students who get in crisis, but also teach the student new skills to hopefully prevent those crisis situations from happening repeatedly. So TCI is the verbal de-escalation piece, which is what all of these modules are about. There's also a physical de-escalation piece that sometimes we need to utilize when students are a danger to self or others. That's kind of part of therapeutic crisis intervention, but not part of the verbal de-escalation module. So we do offer further training in our county. You can reach out to, there's lots of trainers in our county, but you can reach out to Steph or I if you have any questions. I think there's over 30 trainers now in PCI. So we're very blessed to have this whole system actually in our county. So today, you'll see it's lit up green for crisis co-regulation. We are at the point now where we're looking at students who have escalated to the point where they are in crisis and need additional supports. If you've taken any of the other modules, I don't want to spend too much time on going through the triangle, but you'll notice self-awareness is the foundation of this verbal de-escalation of this whole system. And then you'll see you get into active listening. If you took that, I think one of the most important things to take away from that module would have been the reflective responses with students when they might be venting and you might hear something and it's just that acknowledgement of, yeah, when I ask you to put that favorite thing of yours away, it makes you angry when I ask you to do that. Like just really acknowledging their feelings and relating it to their behaviors. And if all else fails, don't say anything. Less is more. You're hearing from 2 social workers today, and yes, we both really like to talk, but in crisis situations, kind of setting that timer in your head to just not talk and not say anything is absolutely okay. And then as we move through that triangle, we talked about behavior support techniques, and I think there are 8 of them, and they're very behavior specific. So if you're that person who's like, oh, I want to know how to respond to students in certain situations and what I can do, that would be a great module for you to watch. I think it's different than the universal supports we normally have in our classroom. So when we talk about behavior support techniques, one of the things we talk about is prompting. A lot of you prompt all the time in your classrooms. You have timers, you prompt toward transitions. It's behavior driven. So you might see that student who's really struggling, like maybe to move on from something. And that's when you would use that behavior support technique of prompting. Or a lot of you know those students you have in your classroom who struggle with getting started, and you automatically go to them. You know you need to get them started. It's a little similar to hurdle help, which is another behavior support technique that we see used a lot, and it's very effective. But again, it's driven by the behavior. It's not a universal technique. So you might see that kid who's sitting at his desk like, oh, I can't do this. I don't even understand what number one is asking me to do. This is ridiculous. You might walk over and say, hey, why don't we read through those directions together and get started together? That's hurdle help. Different than universal supports of kids you already know who might need some of those things. Great. I love behavior support techniques. I think that was module 4 or 5. I think it was 4, somewhere around there, but it's called behavior support techniques, and you can find it if you're interested. So today we're really focusing on where we're at in the stress model of crisis is really between aggression and violence. So we've been triggered, we're escalated. We really want to make sure, sometimes we might still have that outburst. I'm sure you can probably picture a child in your head right now that has been there. In some situations, you can probably think of when it's gone further and you've had violent behavior that may have resulted in a seclusion or a restraint. But I'm sure you can also think of situations where maybe you've supported in a way that has reduced the level of stress to not lead to that violent behavior. So in previous modules, we've worked our way up. Like some of the skills we teach at that lower level of the triangle, people will say, well, that doesn't work for the kids I work with because they're always throwing stuff and they're always screaming and yelling at me. Well, yeah, that's not really what those are for. We kind of move our way up. So now we are kind of there. We're there where that student is in crisis. And we really want to try and prevent that violent behavior from happening. And I think the rest of the module today really is going to be focusing on thinking through what that behavior might look like and how we might respond. So Steph's going to start out and kind of talk about what aggressive behavior really is.
Yeah, so looking at that aggressive behavior and managing how we're supposed to respond, first I want us to kind of look at our individual students and the kids that you work with and think about what are the needs that your kids have. What are their basic needs? What kind of needs do they have every day? And then second would be the meaning. So what behaviors are we seeing? So I want you to take a moment and pause, whether you're by yourself or with a group, and just take a moment and kind of jot down first a list of what the students' needs are. So any of the different types of needs that your students might have. So I want you to make a list and reflect on what are their needs. And then on the other side, I want you to list what behaviors do you see, especially when we're at this aggressive or crisis state with the students. What are some of those behaviors that you see? Whether, maybe they're in your classroom every day it's happening, or maybe you witnessed it down the hall or years past. What are some of those behaviors you might see? So go ahead and take a moment and pause the video and write those down. Okay, welcome back. So hopefully some of you had some good discussion or good thoughts and reflecting on that. And we're going to look at the list that we have here, and maybe you'll see some similarities from the list that you created. So some of them that we created, like needs, right? All of our students need food. Hunger is a big trigger for a lot of some of these behaviors. Clothing, shelter, love, acceptance, that emotional and physical safety. So as humans, we all crave for that emotional and physical safety. And if that need isn't met, we try to get it out in other ways. So for instance, looking at some of the behaviors that we see, running away, yelling, hitting, breaking things, throwing things, crying, shuts down, maybe goes and sometimes climbs under a desk and hides. So we see all these different types of behaviors. Maybe it's biting, spitting, like I said, throwing items. We see these behaviors from some of these students, but when we look at these behaviors, we have to realize that a lot of the times they're using these behaviors to get these needs met. So if I am hungry, I don't know how to regulate that. So I might run away, or I might throw things. Or if I don't feel emotionally safe, I'm going to do something to get myself out of this environment so that I can make sure that I do feel safe. So when we're looking at all this stuff and trying to connect it, we're realizing that all of the behaviors and the meaning of their behavior is to meet a certain type of need. So as we reflect and we move on, we're going to assess how this behavior looks. And this slide might look familiar from one of the previous modules. However, it's so important to look at because it's really hard to remember when we're seeing the intense aggressive behaviors from students. It's harder to remember that they're still trying to meet that need. And we may see that top of the iceberg, those behaviors that you listed, and they might be high and intense and maybe even a little scary, or we're not sure what to do. We're trying to keep everybody safe, but still under that iceberg for them, they're still trying to get that need met, and they have these strong feelings. So we really want to reflect again and remember all behavior has meaning, no matter the intensity of the behavior. It's reflecting the needs, trauma, even more students that have been affected by trauma that can even emphasize the types of behavior. But they have learned for so long that the way I get this need met or how I handle this strong emotion is to have this behavior. And so working through it, if we can remember, if we can put on those lenses to see the bottom part of the iceberg or what's going on inside, we're able to be more empathetic and be able to realize this is how I need to help respond in this. Trauma can permanently alter the brain, but our goal is to look at how we can help support them emotionally and environmentally to help rewire that brain by supporting them. And eventually in our next module, we'll talk about how do we teach them new skills so that we can create new neural pathways in the brain for a new way or in a more safe way for them to be able to get those needs met. We like this slide because how many times, and we do, I'm guilty of it as well. How many times have we heard ourselves or our colleagues or, say, that kid is just so defiant and he's so disrespectful, or she's oppositional and all she does is disrupt the entire class. We all say it, we've all heard it, but instead of looking at it as a way of labeling these students or labeling their behavior with these terms, if we look at it as what are they communicating to us? What are they trying to tell us? What's going on with them? And so if you look at the other side of the different statements, that's under the iceberg, right? Those are the things that they are trying to handle. And with stress and anxiety, the only way they know how to relieve that is by engaging in those aggressive behaviors. So really, this is a good one. This might be even a good one to post up on the wall, or as a good reminder for each other as well. So as we are moving in to aggressive and how to manage them, there really are two types of aggressive behaviors. So when we're looking at aggression, we have proactive aggression and we have reactive aggression. So we tried to find some visuals for you to kind of show you the difference between the two. Proactive aggression is one that you might see more. It's probably displayed more through the media, sometimes through sports, through like criminal activity or like bank heists. You think of them that come in and they appear calm on the outside, but the behavior that they are engaged in are huge. Even just like this video or this picture of this girl, right? Looking at what the facial expression is, but what's going on in the background. And then reactive aggression is more of what we can see it more. And it's actually probably more common. It's definitely more common in regards to students that might be eligible for special education, or those kids that we might be really working on some, behavior plans with or different interventions. And they're really looking at that flood, but we see it and hear it way more than you're going to see or hear the proactive aggression. And the reason why we are going to dig more into these two types of aggression is to figure out how to respond to each one and be able to look at that. It doesn't mean that a student is completely just proactive or just reactive. There can be moments of them coming together. A lot of times some students might be proactive in the beginning, but then eventually at the end of the situation might show more reactive. As human beings, we probably all have a little proactive and reactive aggression inside us, but it's, again, how we have the coping skills to be able to work through those. So we're going to dig a little deeper into understanding the differences of that aggressive behavior. So when we're looking at reactive, right, it's this expressive aggression. So just like in the picture of anger from Inside Out, very expressive, right? You can see it, you can hear it, you can see the expression of the emotions coming out of the individual. It's really this flooding of emotions, right? So something happens, they're triggered about something, and it's almost like they've this loss of control where this emotions have completely flooded, right? And we're not able to rationalize, right? Because when we're anxious, we are stupidest, so we're not able to think through it. So the behaviors we see are in a reaction to this flood of emotions. Emotions are dominant. We do see, like I said, more of a lot of our students that are eligible for special ed in a lot of this as well. The key here is when students can't regulate their emotions, they can slip easily into this reactive aggression as a way to reduce their anxiety and level of stress. And it's that release of that. Definitely associated with trauma, different developmental pieces. So you might see, but when we're looking at these targeted students that we're seeing a lot of this reactive aggression from, it's really thinking, okay, flood of emotions coming in and we see it. And we a lot of the times use a lot of the skills that we've been talking about to help, right? Bring them back down, drain those emotions to be able to work through that. Now, proactive aggression is more operant, very cognitive based, well thought out, planned. A lot of the times they use this skill to protect themselves. So it's not saying that they don't have trauma. It's not saying that they don't have some type of trigger or emotion piece with it, but they have learned to distance themselves from that emotional piece to protect their feelings. They don't want to go to that painful place. So this has been a way, if I distance myself from my emotions, don't allow myself to feel them, then I'm able to feel more calmer, safer, right? It's still a tool to be able to keep that emotional and physical safety. This is a way that they have learned to do that. It's definitely something that maybe they have a thought out plan first. So something might have happened that triggered them, or they became angry, irritated. A lot of the times, if they felt they've been wronged by somebody, and they are the students that can kind of like hold on to a grudge or hold on to a piece that they find the perfect opportunity to be able to get back at that person. So they're able to keep their emotions calm. And sometimes it could be weeks but then they find the prime opportunity to be able to use their aggression, right? It's still a behavior, use their aggression to get back at somebody. So sometimes the emotions may be low, but the type of behavior that we see is a high risk behavior. I think of, sometimes I struggle more with the proactive because I don't think quick enough on my feet. But you almost have to do one step ahead of them, right? They're constantly thinking, they have a goal in mind, and they will do what they need to do to reach that goal. I think when we look at both of these, we have to, again, still remember they're still trying to meet a need in all reality. But you can see the difference. Like I said, so reactive is going to be more of that red face, more of that yelling, screaming, bigger physical outside behavior. Proactive is going to appear more calm and more like menace looking piece. So what I want you to do right now is I want you to kind of think of a student that you have worked with where you've witnessed aggressive behavior, and or whether that's in your classroom now, whether it's been in the past. But I want you to identify like a particular situation, kind of describe it. And I want you to think about, was that reactive or proactive? And how did you know? What did the student sound like? What did they say? What did they look like? So kind of think through that and see if you can identify a situation that there was an aggressive behavior, and if you can look at how to identify that. So I want you to take a moment and pause. Again, if you're by yourself, think through that, kind of process through. If you are in a group, go ahead and pause. You can pause a little longer and go around the room and kind of share some of your stories or thoughts. And maybe you have a situation you're like, I'm not sure which one it is. That's okay. We'll continue to work through that, but really kind of to identify that. So go ahead and take a moment and pause. All right, welcome back. I'm sure once we get storytelling, sometimes we're like going on, and then this happened, or you're reliving the situation as we're looking through that. So hopefully you're able to kind of see or label or identify what type of aggression that was from a situation you have or for a student that you are working with, and kind of be able to see those differences between that as well. So as we're looking or continuing to identify, so this stress model crisis, right? We've seen it tons of times. So this is more of that model for that reactive aggression, right? So a triggering event, agitated, they go up the cycle, and we see those flood of emotions and then coming back down. Again, we're still using our interventions that we've been learning to hopefully have them come back down before it gets to aggression. But however, when it gets up there, still it's that flood of emotions and coming back down. And so this is kind of what we've been talking about this whole time. Now, in regards to the proactive aggression, the model kind of looks a little differently because, like I said, the outside, we see things a little differently. So for a student that has more proactive aggression, there's still a trigger or an irritation. So something has happened where they felt maybe dumb or stupid, or they felt somebody wronged them, or like injustice, right? So there's still this irritation. So we might see a little emotional arousal, but then they're able to, again, like I said before, disconnect from that emotional piece and come back down. So the emotional arousal, it looks like they're at baseline, but the behavior escalation peaks due to the intensity of the behavior. So low emotion, but high risk behavior, just like the girl with the Girl Scout cookies, right? Nobody bought her cookies. She got mad about it. She looked calm. However, setting the house on fire was a high risk behavior. Sometimes we see this with some students that, maybe harm animals, or that this premeditated piece. And you know, that's why we talk about, you know, bank heists, right? It's very cognition focused, right? There's a plan, we're going to do all of this high behavior, but when they walk into the bank, they appear calm, you know, it's not out of control, throwing things, yelling and screaming. It's a calmer piece, but the behavior is high risk. So looking at that proactive is a key piece. Sometimes these students are also ones, you know, we call them the puppeteers. So they can be the ones that will push the buttons of other kids in the classroom, especially kids that are more reactive. So they might walk by them and like whisper something, or they might continue to like poke at them or continue to tap their pencil over and over because they know it's going to get a bigger reaction. So that once the other student has the emotional reaction, they sit back and be like, I didn't do anything. I don't know why am I getting in trouble? He's the one that's freaking out. So you can kind of think through that as well when you're thinking about your student. They're also the ones that know how to push the buttons of adults as well. And they get to kind of try to know you a little personally, and try to use those things to help to get that arousal out of you. So looking at time is still a big piece of this, but really those low emotions, high behavior. So how do we respond, right? What's the difference in responding to the different types of aggression? So the immediate response for reactive, right, is safety. Safety is always number one. We got to make sure the student is safe. We got to make sure that other students are safe, staff are safe. So safety is that number one. The next piece is really that understanding and support. So what we've been talking about, understanding through the reflective responses, supporting them emotionally, environmentally, helping drain their emotions, removing or reducing stimuli, so managing the environment, reducing the audience, reducing the extra noise and things that are going on around it. The key here is to really help drain their emotions to get them back to baseline. So less is more, right? Less talking, doing things that help co-regulate them to be able for them to feel safe and drain that high behavior. So that's going to be our immediate response for reaction. In regards to proactive aggression, our immediate response strategies, first one is still safety. Safety is always trumps everything. So again, making sure safety of the staff and students is that big key piece. The other difference though is that using that emotional support is still needed, but it's in a different way. So we look at containment and negotiation. So again, you have to reach to there's a high level skill, right? It's a good skill to be able to use your brain as your dominant piece, right? That cognitive piece, they're very analytical and thinking through. So using things to help drain their emotions isn't going to work as well. We have to negotiate. And sometimes this is the most difficult for staff. It's really hard when you're like, what? This kid's at this aggressive state, has these high behaviors that they're doing that can hurt other people, and you expect me to negotiate with them? Due to the fact that their emotions are so low and the high risk behaviors, negotiation is the only way to be able to get through it. So containment, so that you know where they're at and how to work with them. But it's a lot of negotiating. There's choices involved. There's sometimes what I even look at is like, hey, dude, I know that you can have this classroom in an uproar in 5 minutes. I need you on my team. I need you on my side. Or what if we do a little bit of this, then we can get a piece of this. So it's a lot of negotiating, reasoning, keeping them engaged in the conversation, using that relationship with them is a key piece. So reactive, less talking, proactive, more purposeful talking, but negotiating and containment. And that's a big key piece with that. When we're looking at the ongoing response strategies for the different types of aggression, reactive, teaching those coping skills, helping them look at how to use self-regulation, right? When I feel this flood of emotions coming on, how do I self-regulate? What do I need to do differently? And so I don't get to that point of full aggression. Teaching them some of the anger management skills. So a lot of what we've been talking about is teaching that once my body starts feeling like this, or I've been triggered and I feel this flood, what do I need to do? Do I need to take a deep breath? Do I need to walk away? How do I notice it in my body? So all of those self-regulation and coping skills need to be taught with the reactive. So proactive aggression, obviously we're still going to teach skills. They're just a little bit different because again, it's not emotion-based. We're going to teach appropriate thinking skills, values, social skills. A lot of times with students that are more proactive, they know the appropriate social skills. We can see it. They know how to appropriately act in a general public environment. So we're going to continue to coach and teach about some of those, but it's teaching that appropriate thinking, appropriate value. And so it's more not of, I'm going to get after this person because of the way that they treated me, but a more of processing through that person did this to me. I don't need to get revenge, but this is how I can deal with it. How do I talk through it with this person? And then looking at rewarding the socially appropriate behavior. So really emphasizing that when they are doing what they're supposed to be doing, really giving that reward for that and not the antisocial behavior, because they love the response, right? They love the reaction of other people based on their well thought out plan. And so we're really looking at that socially appropriate behavior. And so a lot of times with some of these students, I put them in leadership roles or do things that has them still get that full recognition, but it's full recognition for the positive behavior, the socially appropriate behavior. And that really has been helpful, right? For younger kids, you can be line leaders, pass out paper, help with the tech cart. For older students, maybe they are office aides, or maybe they are teacher assistants, or different things along those lines that help get them that recognition for appropriate social behavior. And really looking at the key with both of them for all students. Either way, all students need a caring adult that's on their side. And their needs are still under that iceberg. They still have them. They're still trying to meet the needs of being that emotional safety, that love, that acceptance. All of that, we have to remember to continue to look at that piece. But it's important to be able to distinguish between the two so we know how to respond appropriately. But just remember, no matter what, they all still need a caring adult and someone that's on their side.
So now that we've learned about the different types of aggression, just to bring us back to the stress model, which you'll see quite a bit, it's because that's what we really need to keep going back to kind of assess the risk, of where we're at. The degree of stress, as that increases, the intensity of the behavior will also increase. So I know Steph had you kind of think about those students that might show proactive or reactive aggression, trying to keep kind of some of those situations in mind as we move through the rest of the module. So just that reminder, we're kind of between that aggression and violence stage. We really want to talk about how can we be supportive, and I don't like when this word is used to describe students, but as the adults, we need to manipulate some of those variables in the environment that could lead to violence. So I think as we're talking about these next elements, try and think of situations you've been in with a student where maybe you've seen some of these things actually result in the student escalating into that violent behavior. So we talk about there are certain elements to a potentially violent situation. And there's a lot going on in these crisis situations. I mean, we're telling you to ask yourself those 4 questions. We're telling you to try and figure out what type of aggression is this? Where is this coming from? I mean, we know a lot of our students, like Steph mentioned, a lot of these students have behavior plans. They're very well known to staff in the building, but it's still important that we learn these things about our students. Sometimes it's that student that may just be having that really rough time, and it's not a student we typically see that might become aggressive. So really paying attention to these 4 elements to make sure that we prevent that student from escalating to violence, because we don't want to get to the point where we're having to consider like seclusion or restraint, or people are being hurt, whether that's students or staff. So really thinking through the situation. And I think sometimes this is the one that we might miss, this first one, this potential trigger to violence. This is not what we mean by the initial trigger. So there might have been something that happened like in the classroom that initially triggered the student's behavior, whether it might have been an expectation put on them, something somebody said to them, where we are in a crisis situation, things have escalated. What we mean by potential trigger to violence is something further happens where you might think, okay, I kind of have this under control. And then all of a sudden you have this explosion. It's that emotional release, that emotional kind of explosion from that child, where now we're in that violent stage of that stress model. Some of the things that we have seen happen, it may be that you feel like you have it under control and another adult feels like they need to come in and they're like, you're not doing this right now, we will not be, and then boom, like you see this big explosion. Or I've also seen where objects are taken away from students and you get in that power struggle. Things are okay until you're like, no, you won't have that Chromebook right now, you need to be listening to me, and boom, again, that violent behavior where they strike out or they might throw something at you. So that's what we mean by that potential trigger to violence. So just being very aware of your proximity to the student, like personal space, threatening consequences, like those are things that will trigger a student, even by saying, well, this is going to get you thrown back into juvie, like those kinds of things that you could say to a child. Again, asking yourself those questions, like, what am I feeling right now, to try and prevent yourself from saying something that may trigger that student. It may also be completely out of your control. That peer that the student completely can't stand, or maybe triggered them earlier, walks in the room, is like, haha, I told you so, like, boom, right? Some of these things we can't control, but they are things we try to manipulate within that environment. If we know that student's going to be walking down the hallway, we're doing things to send that student in a different direction, right? So just really being aware of that potential trigger to violence when you've been in a situation and all of a sudden it explodes. What triggered that? And how could we have done something differently? The second is the target. Many times we as the adults can be the target. Property can be targets. Other people can be targets. So, if we can manipulate even one of these things, we have the potential to reduce the risk of violence. It's not like sometimes we can hit all of them, but these are just the things we need to consider to reduce that risk. So if I'm the target, I need to somehow remove myself, right? Or if I am in the situation and I realize another adult or another student is the target, I need to try and remove that target, that individual. Sometimes we remove entire classrooms because we're not quite sure. It's a little bit unpredictable. So the entire classroom is removed as a target. So just making sure, and that can be hard sometimes if you are kind of the observer and you're watching another adult not realize that they are the target. So being able to have those relationships with people to be able to say, you got to go, and that you have the skills and competency to be able to then make sure that you don't become a target yourself. Weapons, when our students are emotionally charged and emotionally out of control, anything within their reach sometimes can become a weapon. And we all like to have these cool, fun things in our classrooms. And, we have to be really aware of when that student is escalated, what is within their reach as a weapon. I mean, their own body, right? Their hands, their feet, they can be used to hit, kick, So when that's the weapon, we have to make sure that we are keeping a very safe distance from them, not putting ourselves in a position to be hit or kicked. We have to be a little bit subtle sometimes too, because if all of a sudden I'm grabbing everything off desks, that could be the potential trigger to further violence, right? Like, oh, game on. If you're gonna take this stuff away, like, here I go. Just being very subtle about removing things. I have had one situation in my career where I think almost every item from a classroom ended up out in the hallway. It just, like, here we go, keep going. Like, it was just like the teacher was moving into a different classroom or something, because that student was going after everything. And you'd be amazed at what could actually be used as a weapon in a classroom. So being very aware of even what you already have in your classroom just on a daily basis and looking through that, even when you're not in a crisis situation. The last thing is this level of stress or motivation. And it really kind of goes back to what Stephanie was talking about really determining, okay, is this more like proactive? Is this really more goal-oriented behavior right now? Because in that moment, the level of stress for that student might be pretty low, but the motivation to get what they want might be pretty high. That's when that negotiating what you know about that student comes into play. If it is more of that reactive aggression, really using your relationship with that student. Steph said, it doesn't matter what type of aggression, the relationship's still important, but really thinking about, this is emotionally based right now. I'm not going to be able to reason or think through this with this child. So how can I reduce this child's level of stress in this moment? It may be reassuring them that you're there. It may be telling them that, I'm going to step back and I'm going to give you some time, even if they're currently ripping the classroom apart. Like, those are things that we need to understand until that child works through that a little bit. Like, we just need to be there and be supportive of them. And Steph talked about that co-regulation and kind of watching as the child, when we co-regulate with them, we're doing this with them, we're not doing it to them. You'll see them start to come down, and that's where you're draining some of those emotions to be able to get to a safe spot. The child may not be down back at baseline, but their risk of violence is greatly decreased. And we still have more work to do to bring them down to baseline. So just these 4 things. And when I think about them, yes, it's in the moment during the crisis situation, but I also think these are really, when you see patterns of behavior with kids, knowing you'll be able to figure out, if you've been in crisis situations with these students over a period of time, even when we have the best of intentions, you'll be able to identify what their triggers to violence might be. You'll begin to identify, I can't have these certain items in my classroom anymore, because those become weapons when they're heightened. And so sometimes we've seen classrooms stripped down to nothing. I've seen cabinet doors used as weapons, so then we remove all of those. I mean, it's also thinking through after, like, what in the future, what might help prevent this student from escalating into violence, and what can we do to prevent it? So not only during, but then after, really thinking through these things. Again, it's not all of these things. It's if you can try and figure out one of these things, either removing a weapon or a target, or trying to keep your distance and not triggering to violence, will really reduce that risk. So I know it seems like a lot, but I think the more you work with your students and notice patterns, the more you'll figure out which one of those things you really need to target during those situations. So earlier, I forgot to mention one of our modules that we've gone through, actually, but being here at crisis co-regulation, this is where you need to call for support. This is where you're teetering on aggression to violence. There are other things, and you'll see emotional first aid, which is, I forgot to talk about that when we reviewed things. If you are the type of person, like, when we're in crisis co-regulation, we need help, we need support. We are probably beyond that student remaining in whatever activity they were in at the time, because there is that safety issue going on. Emotional first aid, if you're interested in learning more about that, really is a technique that's, the goal is to keep that student in that activity with very specific techniques and draining the emotions and things like that. So, and it's meant to be very short-lived. It's very quick, very short, get that student back into what they were doing. So as we think about crisis co-regulation and these students kind of cycling through their aggression, hopefully not the violence piece, but think about those students that, man, if I could just have caught them a little bit earlier, I could have kept them where they're at. You know, sometimes we lose these students and we're like, we know when we get to this point, there's no going back. They're probably not going to be able to return to class. Some of them even leave school. So just keeping in mind kind of crisis co-regulation, we're kind of beyond maybe keeping them in that activity, but if we can keep them from reaching that level of violence, the goal is to at least be able to keep them still in school and not be removed from school because of safety issues. So that's just my little plug for emotional first aid. So we're at crisis co-regulation. We shouldn't be alone. And one of the things we often encounter in some of our buildings is that people aren't really sure what to do. Who do I call? How do I access help? Each building should have what we call a key identified personnel. And you may not be one of those people. It's a team that's trained to respond to these crisis situations. They've been trained either in TCIS or CPI, crisis prevention intervention, is another type of training that we have in our county. But you can also have all of these skills to be able to support, even if you're not part of the identified KIP team with that full training through the physicals. We have many districts who train their entire staff in 2 days of verbal de-escalation. So everybody's kind of armed with those skills. But I mean, at this point, whether you're sitting alone or sitting with a group of people, just thinking through and asking some questions of, do we have a KIP team, key identified personnel? Do I even know who they are? Do I, as a staff member, know how to call for help? And what communication system do we use, to call for help? Because sometimes it's an all call over the building. Sometimes we have walkie-talkies. I mean, in a crisis situation like this, it's very difficult to get on your phone and text that you need help. So just considering how you as the adult seek support when you need further support in a crisis situation. So just thinking some of those things through. If you are watching it alone, maybe that's a great question for the administrator in your building, or if you are an administrator watching this, having conversations with your staff about what that looks like when we're in crisis and we need support. Because if we say, all you have to do is call this number or call this walkie, and if nobody comes, that can lead to panic and stress within that staff member, and can often lead to triggering that violence because they just don't know what to do or what to say. So I kind of just gave a little what to do, what to say for your next section, Steph. So when we think of crisis co-regulation, again, it's that overall really to provide that support and reduce the stress that could potentially lead to that violent behavior. We really just want to reduce the risk of violence. Now, saying that doesn't mean it still looks pretty. Like crisis co-regulation that we're going to be talking about, that Steph's going to share with you, it doesn't sound pretty. It often causes staff to be really uncomfortable because you're kind of letting the student vent in a way. And I think we're all afraid of being judged, and Steph will touch on all of that, but just remembering that our overall goal is to support and at this point prevent violence from occurring. There's already been all kinds of stuff that's probably happened that might have resulted in property damage, all kinds of things. So just keeping that in mind as we talk about crisis co-regulation, that's kind of where we're at with that intensity of the behavior. So Brene Brown, Google her, listen to her podcast. She's absolutely phenomenal. And so what we don't need in the midst of struggle is shame for being human. And I think that's to be said for, especially for students, shaming never works. But for our adults too. Adults, sometimes when we're in crisis right with that student, we may not make the best decisions with the best intentions, but not to judge each other and not shame each other, but really learn from each of these situations. We not only learn more about our students and how they respond to certain supports, but we also learn how we as staff respond in certain situations. And some of us have strengths in areas that others don't, but we need to, bring people up and really recognize the skill sets that people have to support students, and that this is a learning process for everyone. So with that being said, I'm going to throw it to Steph for what crisis co-regulation actually looks like and sounds like.
Yes, thank you, Stacy. So if you're wondering, like, okay, you said time to call for help, but what am I supposed to do until they get there? Or how do I help the situation versus making it worse? Or what am I going to see when staff come and help? And I think, Stacy hit on that, the judgment piece from a colleague sometimes is your worst fear. And it looks like sometimes with crisis co-regulation, it looks like you're doing nothing, but we're actually using all the skills that we've been talking about on that pyramid. We're putting it all together. As I talked about the reactive and proactive aggression and the different ways to respond, very easily you can get into that power struggle, right? So from the module before, our response to either type of aggression can get that power struggle going. And as we all know, it doesn't work out well. So if you want to look at a power struggle in regards to proactive aggression, go back and watch that video of the Breakfast Club, right? So that was more proactive. The student was very calm and kind of getting in that power struggle with them. It wasn't explosive, but the behavior didn't help out either one of them. If then you want to look at an example of reactive aggression from the power struggle video, reactive would be more that role play that Missy and Lisa did together. So you have those two types. But our response in regards to safety and crisis, because by the time it's getting close to violence, they're going to both look a little more reactive. And so this is what we're going to use so we don't get in that power struggle and be able to help de-escalate them so we can figure out the true solution with that piece. So the first part that we're going to see is what to think. So self-awareness, right? We've seen these 4 questions before. We went over them earlier on this module. So the first piece, right? Because no child can learn from a non-calm adult. To co-regulate, we have to keep ourselves regulated. Even if on the inside, we are scared to death or we're anxious and nervous because last time this kid went off, I got hurt, or I don't know if he's going to get hurt. He's throwing things. All of this is happening. So we need to check in with ourselves. And it's okay to say, what am I feeling now? I'm scared. I'm nervous. The key is to recognize that so we don't react on that piece. And I sometimes say teachers are wonderful actors and actresses, because even if we're nervous on the inside, we can't show the kid on the outside. And we use that positive self-talk to say, we can get through, I'm going to help this kid get through this. We can do this. So really asking ourselves the first thing of those 4 questions, positive self-talk. You have to believe that the kid can get through this crisis situation. And as Stacy said, our goal is to not get them to violence. This is our last verbal de-escalation strategy to help prevent that violence from happening. So getting ourselves in check, what to think. The next step is what to do. A lot of times when Stacy and I are working with staff, they're like, I don't even know what to do in this situation when the kid's like this. Well, it's actually more simple than it seems to be. We want like a strategic plan of every step-by-step little thing that we need to do. But when a kid is at that aggressive escalation phase, we need to step back. Take that deep breath, actually showing the kid, like emphasizing that deep breath. And that's modeling, right? Mirroring neurons so that even because if you were to tell a kid, well, you need to take a deep breath, I'm like, screw you and your deep breath, like you're telling them something else to do, but you can model it as well. Step back, give the situation time. We touched on emotional first aid as a quick intervention. Crisis co-regulation may not be quick. the more you use it with a kid, it tends to shrink down the time. But there are times that we've had to work with a student that is at that escalation aggressive phase for almost 2 hours. So really give that time, step back. If it's safe, sit down. Really look at our nonverbal strategies. Remember that what our facial expression, our tone of voice, all those things that are coming in. So think of our nonverbals. So what am I going to do? I'm going to step back, give the situation time. Don't get in that child's space, because you are then being that potential trigger to violence, right? That element where you then could get hurt. Because think about yourself as an adult. When you're feeling dysregulated or you're feeling escalated and somebody starts to get into your space and tell you what to do, y'all really do want to punch them in the face, or y'all really do want to push them back, right? Because you're like, I can't handle this. Usually, as a majority of us that have regulation skills, we're able to say, hey, can you step back? Or hey, I need to step back. A student that doesn't have those skills yet, we need to be that model stepping back. So remember, time, not our nonverbals, are we have an open presence, that protective stance, and taking that deep breath. And then lastly, what do we say? Almost nothing. Especially as educators or adults, we talk too much. We want to talk the kid through it. Even if we have an amazing relationship with them, we're like, oh, I got this. And okay, buddy, come on, let's go. Or I know you don't want to throw that. Oh, you can't throw that. This isn't this. Come on, let's get together. Let's work this. Come on, come to the chill out room with me. And we've said this, all of that in a matter of 30 seconds with great intentions. We always have good intentions, but because again, it's a stressful situation. So we're more heightened. We're trying to fix it so quickly that it's actually causing their behavior to increase. So the verbal strategies of what to say is very little. And then using some of our active listening. I can see you're really upset right now. I know we can figure this out together. I'm so sorry this happened. We're not fixing the problem right there. Because again, our first role is to support them. You know, you can even say, oh, when you take a deep breath, I really like it. I'm really noticing that you're starting to calm down a little bit. The key is spreading those phrases out. Sometimes for me, I have to like count to 30 seconds before or 60 seconds before I say another thing, because I want to say more, but that doesn't work. Silence and time are a huge piece, and stepping back. It's okay to say, I'm sorry. You're not saying that you did something wrong, but you can say, I'm sorry this is happening. I know we can figure this out. I really want to be able to help you. There should be no, but if you would only, just stop there. We will get to that. We'll get to that. In our next module, we'll talk about what to do next. But our job here is to not really say very much. And so when you have walked in on a situation, or a crisis team member has come and you're like, that kid's destroying the room, they're screaming in their face and kicking the wall, and they're just standing there doing nothing. No, they're actually using lots of awesome strategies. They're using their self-awareness. They're giving the student some time and space. They're doing everything that they can to make sure this doesn't go to violence, because safety is our number one concern. We want to make sure that the child is being physically and emotionally safe. Because going through all of that aggressive behaviors can be re-traumatizing for the child too. Nobody likes it. So if we can help co-regulate that. So again, while you're waiting for help, if you can remember what to think, what to do, what to say. I ask myself the 4 questions, check in how I'm feeling. What to do, I'm going to take a deep breath and step back and give some time. What to say, very little. Validate. As simple as that. I know sometimes people are like, we want this whole magic wand. this is the magic wand, giving that time and space. So again, for yourself while you're waiting, or what you may see from your crisis team, what to think, what to do, what to say. Great strategies, again, using all the strategies we've been working on to come together to help these kids. When we look at what we do as educators and helping all of these students, and it's a tough job, especially when you have the intensity of aggressive behavior. We just have to really look at, remember when little people are overwhelmed by their big emotions, it's our job to share their calm and not join their chaos. So if that's one thing you can come away with of saying, how do I be their calm? Because again, little bodies, even if they're big bodies, not able to regulate, they still feel the strong emotions that we do as adults as well. Good stuff. Switch it over to Stacy. She's going to talk about what's next.
Yay, we're not done yet. Module 7. And I really liked how, Steph talked about it is very hard to not only be the person kind of trying to co-regulate through crisis co-regulation with the student, because like she said, you feel like you want to do more too. And the pressure of others watching also intensifies the situation. So I think even if you aren't necessarily the one who will be doing the crisis co-regulation, your trained team will respond, just understanding, what it looks like or sounds like. And like Steph said, sometimes it looks like nothing, but there's actually a lot going on. And moving forward, obviously, there's another whole piece that we're not talking about here, which is the physical management, which no one feels comfortable with it. It's something that we only do when a student is a danger to self or others, and there's imminent risk of harm. And we have to have conversations of what that actually is, because people have different ideas of what dangerous behavior may be. And just recognizing, again, as a staff, to talk through those things and show staff what it might look like if a student might need that physical support. Because again, just like crisis co-reg might not sound pretty, physical intervention doesn't always look supportive, but it is. We do it in a therapeutic way. We all have different philosophies on that, but just knowing that there's another whole piece of this beyond the verbal de-escalation, again, that we hope we don't have to get to. But if you're curious and want to know more about that, feel free to also reach out to staff or I or any of the other 30 trainers we have for TCIS in our county. So next, though, the exciting part is we have one more module, and it's the life space interview. And finally, like the two main goals of TCIS is to support, right, emotionally, environmentally, but also to teach. And we're not going to pull it up again, but that stress model of crisis, it kind of has the bell curve and it goes down this and then it kind of gets flat at the end. That's where we would implement the life space interview when a student is pretty much back at baseline. We're not done yet. There's work to be done with staff and students after that crisis situation, whether it was a verbal crisis or a crisis that resulted in physical intervention. You use the life space interview for either of those. And so you don't have to be a trained mental health professional to use it. So depending on when you're watching this video, that module may or may not be out. So if you look on Learning Stream through the intermediate school district, which is where you have to register for all of these modules, and you don't see module 8, it will be out shortly. So thank you for taking the time today. Like I said, if you've watched this individually or with a team and have other questions or concerns or anything, please feel free to contact either Stephanie or I, and we'd be happy to support you. Is there anything else you want to add, Steph?
No, it's great. Thanks for continuing to show up and watch our modules.
Yes, and we know how stressful it can be in the life of an educator. So the fact that you took some time for whatever reason to watch this module today and maybe other modules, we really, really appreciate all you do for our kids in Muskegon County. So thank you. Take care.
Bye.